Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Roland Thorpe. I'm one of the directors of the Johns Hopkins Alzheimer's Disease, uh, Alzheimer's Disease Research Center for Minority Age and Research with Dr. George Reebok. And we're excited today to have our first visiting scholars program. Visiting scholar, this is a long time coming. We had planned some of this early on, and then, as you might imagine, with the pandemic, if things got delayed, I'm so excited that it is coming to fruition over the next couple of days. And I can't think of a better person to help launch off our Visiting Scholar program than our esteemed colleague and our esteemed speaker over the next 2 days, Dr. Kyriakos Markides. Let me share with you a little something about him, and then I'll turn it over to him to who will be giving us a presentation today. Dr. Kyriakos Markides is currently the Ann and John Neizinger Distinguished Professor of Aging and Professor in the Department of Preventive Medicine and Population Health at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. Dr. Markides, I met Dr. Markides. I was a graduate student when I met Dr. Markides at GSA in San Diego, long time ago. I met him there, and we've stayed in contact over the years. And he's been such an outstanding mentor and outstanding colleague to me. Dr. Kyriakos Markides has co-authored or authored over 400 publications, of which the majority of them are on issues that are relating to aging and health of the Mexican American population. He's currently the PI of the Hispanic EPIs, and EPIs is established population for the epidemiological study of the elderly. And he's also the principal investigator of the NIA-funded Texas Resource Center for Minority Aging Research. He's been listed as one of the most highly cited social scientists in the world. And without further ado, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Dr. Kyriakos Markides, who will be talking to us today on the Hispanic EPIs longitudinal study of older Mexican Americans. Dr. Markides.
Many thanks to Roland and George Reebok for inviting me. It's really quite an honor to be at Johns Hopkins, one of the major centers of the study of aging in a really comprehensive way. And thank you again for, we have a RCMAR also like you do, so we look forward to learning from you. After the meeting, we'll meet the scientists and then we'll meet the faculty tomorrow. First of all, I like to put my presentation on, and I'm getting help because my title is really more than what was published, but it's Hispanic Health and Aging with selected findings from the Hispanic EPIs. And I share this with Philip Cantu, who is here, a PhD from Austin a couple of years ago, and a big part of the study. He did this dissertation on the Hispanic EPIs, and he's helping me a lot. And he's a big part of the study. And and it's also on the market, if very productive and tremendous. So Phil, just say hello.
Hi, I'm Phil Cantu. Like I said, I got my PhD in sociology from UT Austin. I'm currently a postdoc scholar. My dissertation was on living rates in the Hispanic EPIs. And from there, I've kind of moved into looking at sort of the reason for co-residence in the Hispanic population, which is largely cognitive impairment and disability. So I'm starting to move into cognition in Mexican American and Mexican populations.
Well, thank you, Phil. Okay, so some background information on me and the field, really. I've been doing research on this population since 1976, when I actually collected data in San Antonio. And at that time, we were looking at 1970 census estimates. And the data were not of great quality because of problems with the data at the time, but we've done a much better job now. So around 1970, we were saying, wow, this is a huge population. There were 12 million. There were 12 million Hispanics, mostly 2/3 Mexican American. And the census showed over 62 million Hispanics. So a growth of 5 times in the last few years. And the largest minority population, larger than African Americans, and still growing. Not growing as fast in the last decade and a half. And of course, right now with the pandemic, things are really slow. But and then one of the things we know about the population, and I won't speak about it, is that it's a long living population, and with higher life expectancy than the general population, the non-Hispanic white and the African American, a little lower than the Asian American, but they're kind of in a league of their own. And now, of course, we're in a different situation. We're in a pandemic where we have a diminishing of the advantages, and that is part of what some of our group is really looking at now. Going back to 1986, a colleague and I, we were looking at 1980 data, and we proposed an epidemiologic paradox in the Hispanic population, the Hispanic paradox now. Basically, we were saying, what we noticed at the time, that the population was long living, lived as long as the non-Hispanic white population, and except for the Cuban Americans. They were socioeconomically disadvantaged, but living longer. So it's paradoxical because the SES, socioeconomic factors, are correlated with longevity and with good health. And so that was the story then. It was still paradoxical, even though the life expectancy was similar. And paradoxical because there were high rates of diabetes in the population, which are much higher now. There were high rates of obesity, which are much higher now. Similar rates of hypertension, cholesterol. Smoking, actually, I take that back. Maybe among many was a little high. But nowadays, the smoking rates for both men and especially women are low, and might explain some of the mortality advantages in the population. And another thing at that time, we looked at, hey, there was a lot of alcohol binging among men, especially in Mexican Americans and also in Mexico. And then, alcohol consumption among women was going up, and we published about that. With increases in acculturation, and that was but still quite a bit lower than the general population. Another thing against the population, explaining the paradox, the low rates of physical activity, especially among older people. And it was like one of those things that, you grew up and work hard all your life, and you become old, and you earn your leisure. and so not much physical. And we know that physical activity is really important for people with diabetes. So when we proposed that, and we thought that too, of course, people said, well, they have strong families. That's why they live longer, or they live as well, or later longer. And the best we could do at the time was really look at migration selection based on some of our data and based on the literature at that time. Migration selection, well, immigrants are people who are healthy enough to immigrate, right? And they have to pass exams here in Canada and other countries. And then there are also people who are psychologically ready to improve their lives and improve their lives of their families. So migration selection has been around, has really taken off, and all over the world, people have studied immigrant health, and they find that in most immigrants, voluntary immigrants, people migrating for occupational reasons, there are positive consequences, and that's the factor we proposed at the time. Then we went back, and I'm just going to give you a history of how the Hispanic paradox developed. A colleague of mine, Dr. Eschbach, and we looked at the literature, and then at that time, around 2000, the available data were based on vital statistics, and they showed a great mortality advantage compared to non-Hispanic whites for Hispanic. Now, part of the problem there was misclassification of ethnicity on death certificates. Okay, so the funeral directors would look at the dissidents, and then a lot of them were labeled as non-Hispanic white. And, so that was a problem. Now, that has been fixed in more recent years, and about only 6% of deaths are misclassified. And the National Center for Health Statistics, they have figured out a way to adjust for that in their estimates. Now, because of the misclassification problem, people resorted to national community surveys that are linked to the National Attendance Index prospectively, right? So there is no problem here because the ethnicity of the dissidents, of course, is established early on at the surveys. And but even with those surveys that really gave us better estimates, there was still an advantage. And there was one manuscript by our colleagues, Albert Palloni and Elizabeth Arias, who suggested that, there's an explanation using this data of the mortality advantage of the population, Mexican Americans primarily, was because of selective migration of less healthy immigrants to Mexico. This has been around for as long as I have been around, which is 76 and so on. Mexican elderly go home to die. Kind of the salmon bias is called. They home go to die when they get older and sick, and there's some of that, of course, but it's not enough to really explain the advantage. Now, another data set that has been used to study mortality advantages in Hispanics is the Social Security data. They show a lower advantage of Hispanic elderly. These are better data because they are based on people who are able to get Social Security. So that was back then, and but still an advantage of the population. And then we concluded, well, the majority of the evidence supports an advantage, at least Mexican Americans. That was the group we were interested in it. And the self-reports, people are looking at self-reports and of health, and they found out, well, even though these people maybe live longer, they live longer and they rate their health as poor. And well, that was kind of intriguing, but there may be good reasons for people in lower socioeconomic circumstances, African Americans included. They tend to be more pessimistic about their health than the general population. We also suggested then that the population are living longer now, Mexican American, living longer with more disability. We'll get to that again. And this is what was happening, as I said earlier, in the 1970s in the general population. And maybe that's where they are now in the epidemiologic transition, where they're living longer with more problems, whereas the general population is now living longer with fewer problems, or at least has stabilized. And again, there was this challenge by our colleagues of the salmon bias. So there's a kind of a classic paper by Tura and Elo, demographers, with used again these Medicare data that are avoid some of the pitfalls of the other data to examine the existence of the salmon bias. And then they looked at the people who were Social Security beneficiaries in the United States and people moving to Mexico. And indeed, they found that, yeah, there is a salmon bias. Some of these people dying in Mexico, they had higher mortality rates than the people dying here. But it was too small a disadvantage, a mortality difference to explain the mortality advantage in higher life expectancy in the population. So there's kind of a reverse Samoan bias that they talked about and others have, that there are people who have moved to Mexico. Not many of them do, by the way, but they moved to Mexico that when they get sick, they come back to the United States because they have Medicare and they also have their families, okay? They have their children. And so that's another interesting phenomenon. So the point is that we think, and the experts think, that this is a population that lives longer than the rest of us. And this is another source of data. Rebecca Wong, who is my colleague here in Galveston for many years now, and she's a principal investigator of the Mexican Health and Aging Study in the MHAS. And she has told me, and we have talked over the years, that there was extensive migration data in the Mexican Health and Aging Study. This is people 50 and over in Mexico, very similar to the Health and Retirement Study. And she's part of this study, part of the sister studies of the Health and Retirement Study all over the world now. But anyway, their migration data show that a lot of people in Mexico, older people in Mexico, they had lived in the United States, but they returned to Mexico not when they were older, but when they were younger. Average age of about 42. These are people who made some money in the United States and went back home to take care of their families, to start a business. And there are also some people who got sick or failed, who also went back. And but again, older people are not moving back to Mexico in large numbers. And the reason they don't, because this is where their lives are in the United States. And this is where Medicare is. This is where their children and grandchildren are. And I think, and our data have really supported that over the many years we've been studying the population. These are the first official estimates of life expectancy for Hispanics by Elizabeth Arias of the National Center for Health Statistics. And these things have been repeated every year. And through 2019, and this advantage of 2.5 years in life expectancy of Hispanics over non-Hispanic whites holds, and actually maybe a little larger. And then we move to 2020, and of course, and we see a decrease in life expectancy that is very high in African Americans, high also in Hispanics, and high in the general population. We dropped 1.5 years in life expectancy because of the pandemic. And we'll come later to some of the issues that we're dealing with now with the pandemic and life expectancy and the health of the population, and really the prospects for the future. Things seem to be getting worse all over the place. And they are worse for minorities for maybe good reasons, and the media talk about it all the time. So we also found out at the time early on in the history of the Hispanic paradox, but we're not alone. Other people have looked at immigrants to the United States who are also advantaged. Again, the same story, immigrants are self-selected for good health and socioeconomic circumstances, psychological dispositions, and so on. And then, of course, the Asian Pacific population, which is another large immigrant group in the United States, by the way, and it's growing more rapidly than the Hispanics. So the Asian population, of course, is more advantaged. And there are some exceptions to some of the groups there, like the Vietnamese population, for example. In 1975, when they began coming to the United States, they were refugees, many of them. They were not voluntary immigrants. So they, in their later years, which we've been studying more recent years, we're finding out that they do not benefit from the migration, selection, and so on. And so Neil Mehta, who is also my colleague here, he joined us from Michigan a year ago, really incredible demographer, and who studies mortality, studies immigrant selection, and so on. And he did a study of the selection of immigrants 65 and over and lower, and then there are advantages there, kind of similar. People 65 and over. And of course, a lot of this literature before the official grades, they're showing that more recent immigrants are really in better shape. They're more advantaged. And immigrants born in Asia and South America had a 2.5-year advantage over immigrants born in Northern Eastern Europe, Canada, Australia. And they have more barriers to immigration and than they do, and they're more selective. And again, the Asian immigrants is a group in their own league. For another really established hypothesis, and our data show that now and they elsewhere. And I want to give credit to Undercold and Picard, who published Bedard, a paper in 2006 suggesting that immigrants to the United States in this case, but also in other countries, they, after 10, 20 years, they begin to look like the rest of us. They adopt the bad habits. That's one theory. It's a health behavior theory of acculturation theory, negative acculturation. There are all kinds of concepts people use. So in addition to the health behavior changes in some of our writing, we have suggested that immigrants who come as young people primarily, and they work physical labor, many of them, especially men, for a long time, and they have substantial medical care. Mexican Americans have had the lowest insurance coverage in the United States. And of course, people talk about discrimination too. And in the manuscript we published in 2011 and more recent updates, we are looking also, we have looked at Canada, Australia, traditional migration destinations, kind of like the United States. And they show the same story. Immigrants from non-Western backgrounds to these countries also show advantages in mortality and also other health. And also their advantages diminish with time in the host country. And now, who are the people who are not self-selected? Refugees. Of course, refugees are now happening right now with Afghanistan. And people, they're moving. They're not huge numbers yet, but there may be more. We have the experience of the Vietnamese I mentioned earlier. And the other people who are not advantaged, people who are smuggled, they're not voluntary immigrants. There's some of that going on, still going on in US-Mexican border. And also family reunification, reasons for families to rejoin. And here we have primarily older people, let's say I mentioned older people in Mexico who come back to the United States, and older people in Mexico who never came to the United States, but they do migrate when they become widowed, they become ill because they have children here, and they do come. And there's kind of a bimodal distribution in migration of older people, which I point out at the end. People in their 60s, 70s that migrate, they migrate because of declining health. I mentioned bimodal distribution because some of them are healthy enough to move. So you have the people who are not healthy and have people who are healthy, who are older immigrants. We haven't really studied them as well as we should be, as we have the younger people. Now, children, it's another thing we haven't studied very well. Children accompanying their parents are not necessarily self-selective, and they may show disadvantages in their life. The other thing with children coming with their parents, children, they socialize with their peers, their American peers, and they adopt the bad habits. And we know that in male, Hispanic, Mexican American, primarily children, obesity is a really, really big problem. And obesity in Mexico, I should say, is higher than in the United States now. And what that means for the future of migrants from Mexico, are they going to be obese or are they going to be not obese? Just something to be looking at in the future. Now, another part of the Hispanic paradox, and I think I want to take credit to our group because we were maybe some of the first people to point out the immigrant enclave. These are other people, but our study, and I'll talk about our study, like people, older Mexican Americans living in what we call barrio environments, heavily Hispanic neighborhoods in the southwestern United States. They live longer, and they're less disabled over time, and they're less depressed, and they do well. So this is the positive effects of immigrant enclave that is kind of present in the Hispanic population, at least in the Mexican American and also the Asian population. And so let me summarize, because we just published a paper 2 years ago, giving an update, talking about the history of, it hasn't really changed a whole lot. There's some new people doing work in the area. We still think immigrant sex selection is big, and it's an immigrant health paradox all over the world. People are studying health promoting behaviors and sociocultural resources. We cannot get away from that. We have to talk about strong families, even though they're hard to really study. Ethnic enclaves are big in the United States, in some groups. We're finding out their ethnic enclaves are not really big in Europe as much. There's some work in France that show that people living in enclaves in France, immigrants, they do not benefit like we have the benefit of the ethnic enclave in the United States. They don't benefit because they're not integrated into the larger society. So they got issues, something that needs to be studied more. And the Europeans are starting to look at that. An established hypothesis is this convergence to native levels 10 to 20 years, and obesity is kind of a mechanism there, and there may be other mechanisms. And high disability and cognitive impairment in old age. Long living, but we get worse when they get worse. Well, I'm an immigrant too, so maybe I'm part of that too. But some people are talking about diet and legumes, and maybe drawing data from China also. If you know the diet of Hispanic population, and if you like Mexican breakfast like we do, they always serve beans with every meal, basically, in that Mexican breakfast. Now, the most challenging work is by Steve Horvath and his genetics group at UCLA, who are studying people of Mexican ancestry. They have ongoing studies in California, not huge numbers, and they're suggesting lower intrinsic aging in blood, people of Mexican ancestry. And of course, they're just Mexican ancestry. We have other groups. And of course, they're small samples. And, we just don't know. I'm not being from genetics. So when this work came out, in more recent years, I went and see who is citing this first paper, and there are other papers. And the people who are citing, and they're not talking about the Hispanic paradox or the Hispanic event. They're talking about the methodology of studying genetics in populations. And that may be happening, and it will be happening. And there is room to learn there. Maybe there's something there. Now, the diminishing Hispanic paradox, my colleagues, Rogelio Sainz from UTSA and Mark Garcia, who is now at Syracuse, but was a postdoc with us here, they published one of the first papers really looking at the diminishing life expectancy of the population because of COVID-19. This was using 2000 data, and now we got 2021 data coming out. soon, and we will be able to continue this work. And so we have a 1.5 year drop in the United States life expectancy, a 3-year drop in the African American life expectancy, and a 2-year drop in the Hispanic, overall Hispanic life expectancy, and more so for males. And, okay, so there is an uncertain future, which is magnified by the COVID. And the COVID seems to be getting worse, if not better. And the studies in Australia, Canada, and to some extent Europe tend to support the immigrant health paradox. Should not be a paradox in our mind anymore. But we should always be looking for new mechanisms. Genetics is one that is promising. We feel that data is getting better, and we feel this is a real phenomenon. So here's our study finally, and it's been going on for a long time. We funded in 92. We were funded in 92. And we funded through 2023. We're going to do the wave 10. We actually finished the wave 10, a very diminished wave 10, to use that same term. And I'll come back to that. I just give some credit to my colleagues, Philip Cantu, who we mentioned earlier, Philip Brown Downer, who is also here, and others. And then the NIH staff, we had tremendous people being consultants. They've come and gone, and our investigators have come and gone. And many of them have launched their careers based on the study. And I might say the study, like a lot of these big studies, long term, they have led to hundreds of publications, and hopefully we'll keep that going. We have a team in San Antonio with a biostatistician and a psychiatrist who's kind of an expert on dementia, and 2 demographers, sociologists, Ron and Jacqueline Angel, very distinguished also in the Hispanic health and aging population studies, research we do, and they do on their own, and others. So we sampled, like a lot of studies back then, in 92, area probability sample of Mexican Americans ages 65 and over, residing in the 5 southwestern states, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, California. This is, like most studies, the non-institutional population. Very few Mexican Americans are in nursing homes, by the way. The number may be going up. We'll come back to that later. But most of these people are from Texas and California. The other states are really small. And we collected baseline data on 3,050 people, and then we added more assumptions later. And I'll get to that. Please forgive me for this table. Just to look at the first column, which shows the numbers, and we display 9 waves there, and you will see the numbers go down. And in 2004-05, we added 902 people, and then we had a cohort of 2006-9 people back then, which we've been following, and they were all 75 and over. So we kind of started focusing our efforts to very old people, part of which is, of course, cognitive function and dementia, and we'll come back to that later. And then at some point, we added what we called informants. We wanted to talk to other people in the family primarily about the situation of their parents, and many of these were caregivers. So we began doing caregiving research, and we're still doing that. When we added the new cohort, we were able to look at changes in well-being, in health over time. I suggested earlier, without really having firm data, that things seem to be getting worse for the population, becoming more disabled, and they're becoming more disabled because they're more diabetes went up. Diabetes went up, and we showed it in our study in a big way, and especially among people 75 and over. And we thought that was good news and bad news. Good news because people are living longer with diabetes. They're managing it better. Their families are helping. The medical establishment in health is helping. And but the bad news is diabetes causes complications and it's related to problems and they lead to disability. And then along with that, we see cognitive impairment as being, we see an increase in that. We now feel that dementia is really high in the population. Maybe the work that my colleague Brian Downer is doing with Medicare data, confirming the very high dementia in the population. Maybe I'll ask you, Brian, to say something later. But so, one of the things we did earlier, we're actually trying to repeat that. Can we predict, we have this long living population. What predicts surviving to being very old? It's 85 and over. And of course, gender, born outside the United States, very small, but not having diabetes in the years before is really the best predictor. And of course, underweight people have. But anyway, there's a lot of room to do that. Our work on obesity shows that people who are obese, especially in old age, they don't have high mortality rates, except the very obese. And you know what? Interesting thing, even in old age, smoking seems to correlate with the ability to live to very old age. This is a picture of our study. This is really a picture of aging, a picture of many studies, epidemiologic studies. To the right, we have mortality. That's what happens in the end. That's what we study, many of us. But we also study the quality of life indicators, the cognitive function, physical function, emotional function. Physical function has gone up in a big way and has taken over. I mean, the cognitive function has taken over from physical function, is really currently being the number one focus of research. And tomorrow when we talk about the journal and trends in the field, we'll talk about that. But physical function is important, emotional function. And our data primarily look at depression. That's the primary variable there. Physical function, we have disability, lower body function, and measures of strength. And then moving backwards, we have life events, financial problems, stressors, support systems with positive and medical conditions, of course, some worse than others, and impairments. We don't know a whole lot about sensory impairments in this population. People are studying that. We don't have the big studies. What we're really interested, but we have really focused a lot is social class, acculturation, migration, history, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important. About 20 years ago, we added community context in the study because our data in '94 began showing the benefits. Another study began showing the benefits or the dangers of the community. Some parts of communities in the built environment now more so are bad. In our study, we have some benefits of the community and the sense of community and the support systems in areas that have low socioeconomic resources. So that's just something that I think we are looking at now, and other people are looking at that. And I'll show you some of our papers. Recent papers on cognitive impairment and dementia, which is also of great interest to the field in general, but also really good people doing good work at Hopkins and other places. And there was lifetime employment in agricultural occupation. Many of these older people worked in rural areas. They now live in urban areas. And, negatively influencing older men, and women benefiting, of course, from being in the labor force and skilled occupations, even though not many women work. But anyway, there's a recent paper there by our colleagues. Brian Downer and colleagues, they have linked Medicare data to our subjects. And Brian, do you want to say something about that?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Coco. So,
Thank you.
yeah. So this developed from a few years ago. So Ken Ottenbacher, who's now recently retired, he had an R01 grant that, as part of the specific aims, involved linking the participants of the Hispanic EPIs with Medicare claims files. And we have claims files for fee-for-service Medicare beneficiaries from 1999 through, I think, 2018 now. And so we've been able to use the linked data not only to look at, like a medical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease and related dementia, but also to get detailed information about the healthcare utilization of the participants. And so this includes outpatient physician visits, ER admissions, hospitalizations. And so we've been using these data to look at differences in healthcare utilization between people with and without Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And more recently, we've been getting involved in research related to healthcare utilization at the end of life, and most recently looking at hospice use towards the end of life. So having access to these files has really allowed us to do some interesting and innovative research.
And of course, I should say that, there hasn't really been a big study of dementia in Mexican America. And of course, we all know that there's been a big study of people of Caribbean origin, the North Manhattan study, and our colleagues at Columbia University, but it's a very different population there. A lot of them with African admixture. And this, you want to say something about that, because they show disadvantages also. Brian?
Sorry, can you say that again, Kokos?
Yeah, I was just asking your sense of the Caribbean origin studies.
Yeah, so as Kokos mentioned, so New York and Columbia University, they've done a lot of research looking at like healthcare utilization, Alzheimer's disease, and dementia. And their population tends to include Caribbean-based Hispanics. And so some of the demographic and health characteristics of their population tend to be a little bit different than the Mexican American population and the Hispanic EPIs. And so we've found that some of our findings in terms of use of medical services tend to be a little bit different than what's been reported in other Hispanic populations. And so Mark Garcia, who Kokos mentioned earlier, him and his colleagues, we've done a fair amount of work looking at some of the heterogeneity among Hispanic populations and looking at differences based on nativity and country of origin and how that relates to different health outcomes.
Thank you. So there's a lot of work to be done, not necessarily by us, but really by others in dementia. And there is money, because there is Alzheimer's money. So another paper is related. It's people living alone who are more likely over time to belong to an increasing impairment and dementia. There's a funny literature in aging here, because people living alone in the general population, there are some advantages. They live alone because they can. They're healthy enough to live alone. They have the money and the resources. In a familistic population like Mexican American, living alone is the people who are really down and out. They don't have any family members. There are very few of them. And they, of course, are more likely to decline in well-being, and then, of course, develop dementia over time. And again, mechanisms here are important to look at. So again, living arrangements, which was part of Phil Cantu's dissertation. Did you want to say anything about living arrangements?
I don't know if people can hear me. So my dissertation was on living arrangements, and one of the things I did in my dissertation was comparing living arrangements for Mexican Americans to Mexicans in Mexico. And what we found was that there is a much larger proportion of older adults here in the United States who are living with dementia alone. The reason for that is it's a little unclear, but it seems to have to do with sort of ethnic enclave and the ways that Mexican Americans are organizing their life to have more care available to them in proximity, as opposed to having care living with them. Whereas in Mexico, regardless of your cognition status, it seems that everybody lives in extended households.
Thank you for that. And that's something that's really important, is the migration outcomes. There's a lot of work going on here by people here and elsewhere. And so among men, midlife migrants exhibited a significantly lower risk of mortality than the US born, supporting a healthy immigrant effect. People who move early in life. And among women, the late life migrants exhibited an advantage over US born and Mexican origin women. But when it comes to the very old, there are all these disadvantages we talked about earlier, where you have a lot of very old women with more depression. They live longer, but with more depression. And again, our numbers tend to be small in some of these analyses over time. So there's room for more here in the migration and cognitive function, emotional function, and disability literature, which is so big with us, but also big with elsewhere. We have gone to caregiving. Caregiving is funny because caregiving went out of fashion back in the 80s when Steve Zarid, the psychologist from Penn State, wrote a paper saying that, do we need another paper saying that that caregiving is stressful? Well, and I don't know that wasn't really the cause, but anyway, there were a bunch of papers, and then we kind of it was not interesting anymore. What happened in more recent years is a lot more interest in caregiving, because a lot more interest in dementia, and a lot more funding on Alzheimer's disease. NIA has encouraged studies of caregiving. And so we are seeing caregiving in all kinds of population. I'm actually involved in a caregiving study of Vietnamese in Houston, which is a very large population. And so the activities of daily living, disability, and cognitive functioning, and the care of the recipient, older person, not really associated in some of our work with depressive symptoms and other variables and a lot of disability. In other words, there is a lot of tolerance in the population, in familistic orientation, of tolerance of disability in older people. They don't go to nursing homes, they stay in the family, and they are taken care of in the family. And the problem with that, there is kind of an acceptance of dementia as being normal, which is probably present in other populations, in other developing countries and so on, which is good and bad, taking care of people in the family, but also not really providing them with the opportunities that are for better care. But what we found in some of our analysis, that disability and cognitive functioning were not really associated with caregiver burden and depressive symptoms in the caregiver. But when it came to neuropsychiatric behavioral symptoms, using the NPI, the neuropsychiatric symptom scale, 12 item, I believe, but they're showing that, you know, when it comes to neuropsychiatric symptoms, they take their toll on Mexican American population. So on family members. And the other thing is caregivers of older Mexican Americans living in high density Hispanic neighborhoods report fewer depressive symptoms, especially those caring for family members with more severe dementia. Again, going back to the enclave effect that benefits the caregivers in addition to benefiting the older people. And again, maybe this is really suggestive, but I think it's kind of important part of the whole really Hispanic paradox literature, which it is mostly Mexican American. But so what is going on now? We had Wave 10 planned for the year 2020, and we began in January collecting data. And, you know, we were down to like an estimated 300 subjects, age of 90 and beyond. And we wanted to interview them in person, and we wanted to interview 300 of their family caregivers. We were convinced and really knew at the time that just about everybody who is in their 90s in this population had a caregiver. And many of these old people, they live with their caregivers, okay? Maybe half, so much higher than other populations. But after completing about half the interviews in person, we stopped in March, mid-March, you know, we just stopped. And we suspended interviews. And then we kept saying, well, you know, we'll start again in September. Well, that never happened. And then we'll start again in January. Well, that never happened. Then we decided, well, we're going to do telephone interviews. That was the only thing we could do. We couldn't call older people in their 90s on the phone. That was not going to be very productive. And again, we said, well, let's just call the caregivers. You know, the younger, but some of them are in their 70s, right? Because we've been studying these people for so long. The very old people are in their 90s. And maybe now we're looking at, you know, very old people and predictors of mortality in very old people. We have a paper accepted recently on that. And so anyway, after completing half, we stopped, and then we started telephone interviews. And we had a hell of a time, you know, people answering the phone, people changing their phones, because some of these people that we were able to easily find over the years by showing up in person, but calling caregivers and older people, it just didn't, it wasn't happening. And so we went to telephone interviews. We ended up only with 101 complete interviews. Some of them were people we interviewed the year before and we stopped, right? Some of them were new. And we ended up with 101 complete interviews with people who had living subjects, older people living, many of them living with them. And then there were 33 subjects who were deceased during the pandemic. And of course, we thought they were very interesting because we have reports from caregiver on the experience of the death of a loved one in their 90s. And is this, we haven't analyzed the data, is this really a relief? Is this a problem for them? And we don't know yet. We're looking at that. And again, the numbers are really small. And very few of these 33 people, I don't know, about 4 or 5 died of COVID, by the way. And we know that the death of COVID in the population is really high. So what's the future? Well, we're running out of people, right? We're running out of subject. So now our group is looking at, well, what do we do next? We can't really write a grant to follow everybody to their death. Well, we could do some of that. But we can think about adding a new cohort. And a new cohort will give us more information about studying trends in the health of the population over a longer period of time, which I think can be useful. The other thing we're thinking about is Alzheimer's disease, just because there's more money there. And just because we have some expertise there, but we don't have the best expertise when it comes to neurology and so on. So that's just something that we're going to begin to look at and think about. And I want to say something about caregiving and what we're doing now with the data. And I'm going to turn to my colleague, Phil Cantu, who is kind of leading the effort there in analyzing the data, and who's going to talk about that and what else we're planning in the near future.
This is Roland. I just got my eye on the time and the agenda, and it's so we can ask Phil to do this very quickly so we can allow the our audience to ask a few questions before we have to move to meeting with the scientists.
Sure, I can go very quickly. I want to say that, we have this unique data set where we have these 101 individuals who we interviewed their caregiver after the pandemic. And we have 70 of those individuals who we have a pre and post interview for. So people we interviewed in March 2020 and then again in March 2021. And so I think we're going to have a unique opportunity to really look at the stresses that the caregivers took on during the COVID pandemic. And in the kind of lull when things seemed like they were kind of opening up again before the new Delta variant. So that's all for me. We can go on to questions.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. And yeah, Roland, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kyriakos, for the outstanding presentation. Every time I hear a presentation from you, I learn more and more about the Hispanic EPIs. I want to also thank you for leading this and over the years and actually improving the health and well-being of the people in the Hispanic EPIs and providing the evidence base for which policies can be created to improve the health and well-being. At this time, I'll open it up to people for some question and answer. We have time for maybe about 2 or 3 questions. Let me get to my screen. Yes. Anyone have a question?
Well, I'll ask it's not really a question, I guess, but like thinking about when you're talking about interviews like the 70 that were just mentioned, are they all structured interviews, or is there an opportunity for people to talk about their experiences and how they've adapted to aging or COVID or anything else?
That's a really good point, because what we have done so far is primarily structure, and we have added some open-ended stuff now. The other thing we're doing that really answers your point, we have a colleague, Maria Aranda, who is kind of an expert on caregiving at USC, who is going to take some of the people that we interviewed, whether their parents died or not. She's going to do qualitative interviews.
Yeah.
And that's going to be rich, right? In the kind of information we get.
When you ask people questions, they tell you what they think you want to know about, but you need to give them a chance to tell you what they're thinking about, is the way I look at it. It can be surprising what people bring up.
And I think that, an expert qualitative researcher will tease out all of these issues.
Right.
And, we know that this population, there's a lot of naysaying in less educated people. When they say things, they say yes, yes. And, they want to please you, social. Right. And so that's a really good point. Yeah. Yep.
Hi, I'm Alicia. I am so impressed by this body of work, and I thank you for sharing it with us. I was wondering if you knew if you experienced any differences depending on whether interviews or data is collected in English or in Spanish, or how you handled language, and if you noticed any differences because of that.
How do we handle language? Of course, most of the older people we interviewed were interviewed in Spanish, and even to our surprise, when we started interviewing their children, their family, they were mostly interviewed in Spanish. So we have, followed standard procedures of translation, and like you probably know that you can never have perfect translations of concepts and things, but that's a big part of the field and becoming bigger. Yeah. But that's a great question. And, so if Joe is leaving, see you tomorrow. Yes, thank you very much for your comments. Anybody else?
Yeah. I have one final question, Coco. Because we both run RCMARs, and the RCMAR is about the development of early career scholars. I'm gonna act like I'm an early career scholar. So I'm no longer Roland, I'm Ronald. I just got this pilot award from this guy named George Reebok, and I've just seen this outstanding presentation by this man named Markides. Can you just share with us, share with me and my other early career colleagues, you've been doing this since '92 with the Hispanic MPs. Can you share with us what one thing did you learn about staying with this study along the whole time up to 2023?
So, this is the toughest question of all of us. When we have these big studies going on and a lot of money spent, I think what we have learned, is that there are some advantages and disadvantages in the aging process of this population. And by aging, I mean aging from youth to middle age to old age. And the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is the Hispanic paradox. And we contributed to that. And the long living population. And then related to that, which may be another paradox, is that they live longer, but they live longer with more problems. The other thing that we've learned is the enclave, and we make contributions here, the enclave effect, that is kind of unique to maybe the Mexican origin population, where people live in barrios, what we call barrios, but that don't have the resources. They don't have the parks to walk. They don't have but they have the Mexican resources, the social, the family resources, and so on. So that's kind of a short answer to your question.
So thank you so much, Cocos, for that answer. And I really want to say thank you again for all the contributions you made throughout your career. And I thank you for giving us this presentation, outstanding presentation today. And we look forward to your presentation, and we look forward to learning about some do's and don'ts as it relates to publishing tomorrow. So I invite everyone here to please, if you haven't registered, to register for the presentation tomorrow, where we'll be led in a presentation, and then get into some conversations about publishing and aging as it relates to the Journal of Aging and Health. I'd like to turn it over to George, my co-director. George, do you have any final words, George?
I just want to add my thanks, Cocos, for just an outstanding presentation, such important work, and we can't thank you enough for sharing with us today. And we'll see you shortly after this meeting when we meet with our RCMAR scientists.
Really
and
wonderful to be with you. Yeah, thank you again, George.
All right.
And the team,
So thank you all who've attended, and for the scientists, we'll see in about if my math is right, or arithmetic, is about 13 minutes, I think.
Okay.
It's not 13 minutes. I don't know. We'll see you at 2:15.
About 8 minutes.
Cocos is still keeping me in check.
Take us a bathroom break. Anyway, thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.
We'll be back.